What's up, friends? Today we're going to be covering the 5 opening mistakes every chess player should know, and these are either powerful opening traps or powerful attacking patterns that you can use right from the first moves. In the first game, I started off with knight to f3, aiming for some sort of the Tennyson gambit, which works if black goes here pawn to d5 or even pawn to f5, which was played into the game. Here white surprisingly sacrifices the pawn on e4, and at first it's hard to see the reason of gambiting this pawn. Therefore black captures it, and now our knight goes forward to g5, attacking this pawn. Therefore black decided to defend it, and white attacks it once again. But this is a doubled and weak pawn of black, therefore black happily trades it off. But this allows white to bring the bishop into the game just as well. And because black has moved this f-pawn, that weakens their king, and this creates a lot of interesting tactical patterns. Basically, this f7 square is the weakest square in black's position, and therefore whenever there is some sort of weakness there, it is always dangerous. For example, black cannot play h6 trying to get rid of this knight, because that would end in a really quick checkmate with bishop to g6. In the game, black played a move which seems a lot more solid, pawn to d5. Black is not weakening his position, and on the opposite side, he's opening up the diagonal for the bishop, grabbing the center. Everything looks pretty cool. But white is forcefully pushing the same tactical motif. They want to make use of the weakness of this diagonal, and they sacrifice the knight on h7 in order to eliminate the defender of the square g6. And after knight takes, white followed up with bishop to g6, check to the king. The king has only one square to go to, which is to d7, but after that queen to d5 is a surprising finish of this really quick game. In the next example, white opens up with the most standard move, pawn to e4, and after pawn to e5, white went for my favorite opening, the bishop's opening. I've got another video that covers it in greater details, but for now let's just look at one of the variations, which is really fascinating. Black plays knight f6, very natural move, attacking this pawn, but white ignores it and just plays knight to f3. Now here black often realized that this pawn is actually hanging, and why not to take it? On the next move, black is ready to play d5, and seems like their position is really great. But you play knight to c3, and you keep playing in a gambit style. You don't aim to get your pawn back immediately, but rather you prefer to get ahead in development and turn it into a powerful attack. Now black trades on c3, which allows you to open up one more piece for your attack, and although black is a pawn up, his position is already very dangerous. In fact, in most cases, black loses this game so badly just right within the next few moves, because you have a lot of pieces in the game already which are ready to rock and roll, your queen is ready to move forward, and black is completely passive. That just easily explains why his position is so dangerous. Now the most direct threat is knight takes e5. But even if black defends this pawn somehow, which in the game they did by playing queen to e7, there is one more threat which they usually overlook. This is the move knight to g5, and you see that in this second example white uses the same general attacking pattern, attack of this weak square on f7. And black is already defenseless, there is no way to defend this pawn normally, and in the game he played pawn to f6, trying to at least save the pawn, and here white missed the chance to win the game in a really spectacular fashion, which just goes to show how useful it is to know common tactical patterns. In the game, white played knight to f7, trying to attack the rook, but that leads to a more complicated game. Instead, bishop to f7 would win the game instantly. The bishop is defended by the knight. The only square for the king to go to would be king to d8, and although right now it looks like black is absolutely cool, there is a very sudden move knight to e6, and it turns out that our queen from d1 was standing in an ambush and was helping us to deliver this almost checkmate in a really funny fashion with just a knight and a bishop involved. The only way for black to avoid the checkmate would be to sacrifice his queen for the knight, but still the pawn is pinned, he can't even take the bishop, and it's complete game over. This time we're playing black. Let's see what we've got here. After e4, e5, knight f3, so far it's all standard. Black surprised his opponent by playing pawn to d5. Not the mainstream move, but it's not as bad as it seems. We're still opening up the diagonal for the bishop and challenging white's center. White took this pawn on d5, black recaptured, knight to c3, queen to a5. Oh no, black got something like the Scandinavian defense. But white here realized that this pawn is weak, and they decided to attack it by playing queen to e2. And at first it looks like, yeah, black is somewhat in trouble, but black just defended the pawn for now. And here white realized that he could play pawn to d4, but it's quite committing. Black can start playing bishop b4, counter-attacking along this diagonal, bishop g4, pinning this knight over here. So it's actually dangerous for white as well. And white decided to take a slower approach and just played pawn to d3 first, just aiming to develop. Black played bishop to g4, and white decided to go bishop d2, neutralizing the spin and opposing his bishop to the queen. Currently, white is ready to possibly castle queenside, and it looks like his position is nice, but black used a very smart tactical pattern. He played knight to d4. Now, whenever this knight is pinned to the queen, it is always a good idea for black to jump with your own knight to d4 and to increase the pressure over this queen and this knight. This usually starts quite a powerful attack. But in this case, white wondered, hey, I can just grab this pawn e5, right? This is left undefended because the knight left the c6 square. So this pawn is hanging. Let's just capture it. Queen takes, knight takes. White was happy. He's attacking the bishop. He's a pawn up, but all of a sudden, knight takes c2 delivered a checkmate. In the next example, black used a truly evil opening variation. After e4, e5, so far so good, we go into the usual game. Both sides simply develop their pieces, but after bishop b5, instead of developing his own dark square bishop, black went for the counterattack known as the Rubinstein counter gambit, with knight to d4, putting pressure to this bishop and to the knight. It turns out that for white, it's not very good to trade off here, because in this case, your pawn starts attacking this knight, and then this pawn might be hanging, so it's not as good for white as it might seem, and therefore white usually just drops their bishop back because currently it's being attacked. So they played bishop a4. And black played the move pawn to c6, the move which is hard to understand at first, like what's even the point. And also like sacrificing his own pawn on e5, which seems like white can just capture it with no negative consequences. But anyway, we'll see in a moment what black has in mind. In the game, white just castled, black played bishop c5, black keeps ignoring this threat, and white decided, hey, why not to grab this pawn finally? And here's the point of black's plan. He played pawn to d6, attacking this knight over here. And it turns out that when the knight goes back somewhere, it doesn't really matter. What black has prepared is to play bishop g4 on the next move, hitting the queen, and all of a sudden it's quite uncomfortable for white. In the game, white chose to play knight to d3, black still played bishop g4, and what can white do now? I mean, the queen is attacked, white needs to cover it somehow. a3 would fail in a quite spectacular fashion because knight takes a3 would be a discovered check as well as a double check, and white grabs this pawn and then wins the game. After king h1, black can do something like knight h2, I guess, using one more tactical motif and then grabbing the rook, so that's complete devastation. Therefore, it makes sense that in the game white played queen to e1, just removing his queen from danger, and it looks like white's position is absolutely fine. But nevertheless, black still used the same tactical trick, knight to f3. And right now, black is just sacrificing the knight for nothing really. There is no immediate checkmating attack, but the plan is pretty simple. On the next move, black wants to play queen d7, queen g4, boom, that's a checkmate. The plan is simple, but it's hard for white to stop it. Anyway, white tries to keep things complex, and he plays pawn to e5, saying, hey, I want to counterattack your king actually along the e-file. Black says, I still don't care about material, he just castles. He puts his king to safety, and now his main plan is still the same, just playing queen d7, g4, checkmating the king. White played a tricky move, pawn takes d6. And at first looks like, hey, I can just recapture one way or the other, but it turns out that recapturing a pawn is actually bad. If black were to take it with a queen, that would allow white to play queen e5, involving his own queen into the defense, as well as attacking a bunch of pieces. And let's not forget that white is a piece up at the moment, therefore if he can defend successfully, he'll probably win the game. Therefore, that's not what black played. But what he did was really mind-boggling. He played knight to g4, saying, I still don't care about material just at all, right? You can take my pawn, you can take my knight, I couldn't care less. But white say, hey, you know what? I want to trade queens, and he played queen e7, which looks like a great move at first. So queen to e7 blocks this queen from jumping to h4, which black would love to do, and to capture this pawn, and queen e7 stands on the way, therefore we can't go in this direction. And if we trade queens, it looks like the attack will be over, white will enjoy his extra material, wouldn't win the game. But black says, alright, let me finally get back this little pawn on d6, and white resigned. It turned out that even though white can force an exchange of queens, that doesn't help as much as white wanted to, because bishop takes h2 leads to a very interesting checkmate. And here's one more attacking pattern for black. Here in the game, white went for the Vienna gambit with pawn to f4, and there's a very nice idea here which is useful to know. Whenever your opponent tries any kind of gambits against you as white, it's usually very much advisable to counter-strike in the center with the move pawn to d5, because whenever you start accepting gambits, very often you find yourself in trouble. Your opponent starts attacking you, this knight can't go forward, has to go back, and white seizes the initiative and the advantage. Also, whenever you let your opponent get ahead in development, that always creates a lot of nasty attacking possibilities for your opponent. Therefore, it's it's better to ignore any kind of things when they want to gambit this pawn or this pawn sometimes. Counter-striking in the center of the board is usually a really effective way to shut down his attack early. Now, after pawn on d5, white decided to take on e5, but now knight takes e4. Black is still doing absolutely good. White traded on e4 and decided to go pawn to d4. So far so good, he's just developing. Here black took en passant, a useful thing, in case you don't know. Like, if your opponent moves his pawn 2 squares forward, you can actually take it, as if it moved only 1 square forward. And after bishop takes d3, black now just develops, and you see that black has no problems whatsoever. He's attacking this pawn, he's got free development. White defended it. Now bishop to c5 takes away this square, and therefore white can no longer castle. So white decided to prepare his castling queenside, and he started to develop these queenside pieces. He played bishop f4. Now bishop g4, once again, notice that we put this pin. If your opponent doesn't know how to handle it, very often they get in trouble quickly, such as in this game. They played queen e2, hoping to castle queenside on the next move, but black continued utilizing this pin by going knight to d4. We already know this tactical trick. We're making use of the pin, white's knight can't move away or else they will lose the queen. And therefore knight to d4 marks the beginning of black's powerful attack. White needs to defend his queen as well as the knight. Also, our bishop is active along this diagonal, therefore something like queen to f2 would not work for white because knight takes c3 is check to the king, and we're gonna win white's queen on the next move. So let's take it back. That was not played in the game. In the game, he instead played queen to f1. Looks a little awkward, but at least white maintains the guard of this knight. A lot of players in this position would just trade on f3 one way or the other, but you know the rule to take is a mistake. Usually it is more advantageous to just keep increasing the pressure instead of releasing it and making your opponent's life easier. Therefore, instead of trading on f3, black added one more attack to the same square by playing queen to d5. And now this knight is attacked 3 times, therefore white definitely needs to do something about it. Of course, it looks like white could just trade it off, but then our bishop comes to a very active square, attacking all around. Also notice that white's king cannot move, cannot castle, because this square is controlled, so white's in trouble. In the game, white decided to drop the knight back to d2, black castled queenside, and now white's still in trouble, because he still can't castle because of this thing. Also, even if he can drive away this bishop somehow, if he tries to castle queenside, this rook would move away, and this pawn on a2 would be hanging. So he decided to drive away this queen from its active square, but black has prepared a powerful counter. Queen takes e4, a very unusual queen sacrifice, and after knight takes c2 led to a pretty cool checkmate, delivered mostly by minor pieces, even though rook is playing a small role into this whole attack, because the rook is taking away this d2 square, and finally the king is killed. And here comes a little quiz for you. Let's see if you can utilize one of the tactical patterns we talked about today. And this game was played between a grandmaster and an international master, so it works on a really high level. So far we're entering the time-honored variation of the Sicilian defense: knight c3, h6, bishop to f4, knight to e7. Black decided to be a little bit tricky. He wants to support this knight on c6, and the knight from e7 can either go to g6 and hit the bishop, or maybe black can trade off his extra knight from c6 and the other one would replace his brother on c6. And it's all nice, but there is one core drawback of black's plan. These dark squares are weak, and white took advantage of that with a really surprising sacrifice. He just played knight to b5. Despite of the fact that the knight can be captured, which black did, but after that knight takes b5 still threatens simply knight to d6 checkmate, or maybe knight to c7, which would fork the king and the rook. Black noticed that and played pawn to d5. And here's my question for you: what's the best way for white to finish it off? And if you can't find the winning combo, please write it down in the comments below. Today we've been talking about chess tactics, and if you'd like to improve your positional chess, these free masterclass will be helpful. I hope you'll have a great rest of the day, and I'll talk to you soon.